without further ado, let me welcome to the stage STARCOM Command Team, Major General Sejba and Chief Master Sergeant Pogue. Thanks so much.
All right, if you can go ahead and play that first chart.
Kidding?
All right, hey. What's that? It could be. So that was obviously a little bit of a mashup to start things. And so there was one person singing and another person's tune. So if you know what either one of those were, shout it out.
Where are my Swifties at? I know we got Swifties in here.
All right, Swiftie, and what was the other part? Billy Joel, all right? So if you think about culture, there are two icons, certainly of pop culture. Different generations, but two icons. And so when you think about culture and where we're driving the service, it gives you an idea that even in pop culture, there are ways that folks connect, identities that they tie themselves to, and certainly followings that become themselves.
So they're both huge pop culture icons, and we have the ultimate responsibility in STARCOM to build that culture up for our Guardians, to understand and instill the Guardian spirit and the values that our Guardians carry throughout their careers. STARCOM every Guardian gets to start their career in STARCOM. It's where the Space Force starts. And so instilling that culture in what we do is inherently important to ensuring we deliver and prepare those Guardians that are conducting the operations and protecting the domain and ensuring that we're delivering warfighters to your organizations.
So as we were thinking about how to start today off, let me first of all say thanks to SFA and just a phenomenal event so far, not only today, but throughout the last several days. I think this goes back to probably last April at Space Symposium when we sat down with Bill and the team and we said that we wanted to have a big part in participating this week. And I said, we're going to do this as a command team. So it's not very often that you get to share the stage with your rock star SEL.
Or a rock star boss here.
We're glad to be here. One of the things that I really want to highlight, though, is just the identity and the culture that I think we in STARCOM, certainly with our other field commands, are helping drive from a warfighting perspective across the entire service. So if you don't mind, if you can go ahead and play the video.
Culture. Culture is what defines us. It's what motivates us. It creates our identity as a military service. Space Training and Readiness Command harnesses our culture and forges those who raise their hands to serve our country into America's Space Force Guardians. Our Space Force culture is built on values of character, connection, commitment, and courage. It's a culture that encourages innovation, fosters collaboration, and drives progress. Guardians are united by a common purpose: to defend our nation's interests in, from, and to space. As Guardians, we are more than just our individual identities. We are innovators, we are explorers, and we are leaders. Our culture blends the best of America's military tradition with a forward-thinking mission mindset needed for the joint fight as we guard the space domain. STARCOM prepares the world's best space warfighting forces to outpace the threat. From our Guardians' first steps to wargaming, integrated test, training, doctrine, exercise, and education, STARCOM imprints our culture that drives us as pioneers, guarding our boundless future. Semper Supra.
Awesome. All right, yeah, thanks.
Wow.
Thanks. So with that as a backdrop, we thought, what better way to really talk about the important STARCOM mission than to walk through some of the things that you heard about from the CSO this morning and certainly across some of the other speakers. I will be the first to tell you that the CSO's analogy of the mountain and not knowing where the destiny is certainly something not lost on us. We know that there's a lot ahead of us still, but every once in a while you have to take a step back and really look at what have we accomplished, and I think we've accomplished quite a bit, certainly not only within a command, but across commands as we really try to drive warfighting and readiness differently than maybe we had just even a few years ago. So what better way to do it than some testimonials and tell you a few stories about some of the things that are ongoing across STARCOM, and then to hear from real Guardians and their experience as they've gone through these courses.
Definitely. Rather than hear it from us, as Major General Sejba alluded to, we want to hear it from the Guardians that have experienced how we are fundamentally shaping our training, education, test, range and aggressor, and education domains. And a big shout out, as I owe our Space Delta 10 team, and a thank you to the CSO in signing out our newest piece of Spacepower Doctrine 6.0. So I just wanted to highlight that as that comes to a Space Force portal near you.
Awesome. All right, Chief, why don't you launch the first example?
No worries, sir. So moving into that first example, right, we talk about our Guardians and what they're doing. And the big one here is the experience we have with Stark. And this is where we send a small cadre of Guardians, both officer enlisted, off to MIT and Lincoln Labs to be able to learn from some of the best radar operators in the world. They get to experience and observe and ask those hard questions on what it means to operate these systems, how they can challenge the problem sets that they have in their organizations, and how they can solve those hard problems moving forward. You see some of just the testimonials here on the slide from our Guardians that have experienced that, and where they've learned to integrate cyber defense, multi-layer radar sensor operations, and non-kinetic target development, right, from some of our best industry and civilian partners, and they are integrating that into those ops floors that you heard about today from our teammates over at Space Operations Command, and how they are empowering their officer, enlisted, and civilian corps to lead and learn from one another. And so it's been an incredible experience. We just wrapped up our latest Stark cohort last month, and starting January, we'll be sending another cohort through to learn from this partnership that we have moving forward. It's been incredible in what our Guardians have experienced, what they've learned, and what they take back to their organizations.
Yeah, and I think so far we've sent over 80 Guardians through this. They go there for 3.5 weeks. And again, in many cases, they're going there with some of their hard problems, some of the things they haven't quite figured out how to solve yet. And by sitting side by side with some of the leading experts across our country, they're taking some of that advice back to help solve some of the Guardian problems differently than we would have been able before. I'd offer, there's a lot of industry in here, so this is an example of an experience that we're trying to replicate across multiple areas. So as you sit from your company's lens and you see opportunities where we could send Guardians to understand maybe the space domain differently than they do before, or maybe some of the latest tools, things that could help us in solving problems. We're trying to find those opportunities where we can send Guardians for those experiences and take expertise, because again, you heard this morning, we're 15,000 strong. But when we start adding in our industry players, we become a lot larger and a lot more powerful, especially if we're learning together. So that's one of my asks to all of you, is to help us find other experiences like this that we can start to create for our Guardians, officer, enlisted, and civilian going forward.
All right, so I think our next slides, you want to share on how we're reshaping an educational experience for our officer Guardians.
I'm sure there's probably at least one graduate of JHU that's in the audience today, but I tell you, this has been a phenomenal success. When I took the job about 1.5 years ago, literally I think it was like 2 or 3 days before the very first class started. And the team was very quick to remind me that CSO number 1, this was one of the first things that he asked the team to go do, was create an independent school for IDE and SDE. And so Johns Hopkins University is our answer to that. This is the first time, at least as far as I'm aware, that a service has actually partnered with a private academia university to actually provide this type of academics. Last year, the very first cohort that started had 51 Guardians, joint service members, and even 1 ally and a few civilians from across the DoD and the IC. This year, we have well over 80 with even a larger coalition partner presence. This really is fundamentally changing how we're going to do education going forward. I think the coursework that they went through, 10 months, they had 5 or 6 core classes, they had 4 electives, and again, the electives are courses that they're taking with all the other civilian students that are going through Johns Hopkins. And they're learning from leading experts in things like policy, folks that have probably lived policy for the last 10 years inside DC. This is the type of education that stays relevant, it's consistent, and it's certainly the type of partnership that we're looking for as we go forward as a service. About a month ago, we held our first partnership day out in the DC area, and I talked about experiences. We talked a little bit with academia or with industry about experiences, but we also invited most of our university partnership program universities and then several of our key teammates from around Patrick Space Force Base to help us in reimagining how we would do education and training for Guardians in the future. Again, Johns Hopkins is a great example of how we're trying to do this, and you can see a few of the quotes. In some cases, the best PME that a member had ever received over the course of their career. Other cases, you can see some other thoughts from the small cohort or being partnered with civilians both in the class and with the larger university that, again, they may not have gotten in other places. So this is a great example of how we are looking at doing things differently. Again, this is how 15,000 strong becomes even stronger when you partner differently and you reimagine how education and training could and should be done for a service our size.
Sarah, talking about reimagining education, let's hit that next slide. I want to highlight STARCOM's Polaris Team of the Year, the Vossler Academy. Where are my Vossler Del 13 teammates at? I hear them. When we own true reimagining of what an educational experience should be like, the Vossler team, along with many, many Space Force partners and other organizations, were key to instilling the experience that we are now bringing to our enlisted force. Late last year, we took about a 5-month pause to really assess on what we needed to deliver back to our enlisted force. And Vossler delivered on that when they executed Vossler Fellowship 2 early last year. And our fellowship model emphasizes the constant interaction between students and their instructors. So it's no longer just podium teaching and here's what you need to know and let's validate that with a test. It's the true operationalization of critical thinking, ensuring our Guardians not only have the Guardian development that is key in the Space Force, but ensuring that we can capitalize on that combat credibility and capabilities that our enlisted force brings to our service. And in Vossler 2, which is our non-commissioned officer academy equivalent, participants and our students are equipped with intermediate leadership skills. We pour in critical thinking so they can understand what it means to solve those hard problems. We want them to be space-minded warfighters and leaders, because that's what we owe to them. They are learning on how to lead with empathy and to understand the teammates that they have been entrusted with. The course also focuses on, and I want to get this right, the critical analysis of information, what it means to be an ethical leader, conflict management, team motivation, and understanding the strategic and operational environments. So we're building that baseline and those Guardians that are in your formations. And
Fellowship 1 taught me...
Oh, let's play it. Because I think you'd rather hear from our Guardian rather than hearing from me.
Fellowship 1 taught me all about different methods of communication that I really did not know, and it really pinpointed on where I needed to be as a leader and what I needed to correct.
How much the individual matters when it comes to how we communicate and how we form a team, and that bleeds in directly to how we handle great power competition.
You're challenged to really think and operate outside of traditional frameworks.
I learned about a myriad of different leadership tactics and strategies. I learned about adaptable leadership. I learned about authentic and servant leadership. And I feel like all of these are vital skills to use to forge teams for great power competition.
And it also taught me how to adapt my leadership skills during peace and war.
You're really empowered to bring that guardianship to your unit, and that lets you lead your teams to just maximum effectiveness.
All right, those were just some testimonials from our Guardians that have attended Vossler Fellowship 3 and our most recent cohort of where we executed the beta course of Vossler Fellowship 1, the foundational course for our junior enlisted, for those brand new specialist fours and sergeants that are stepping into those leadership and operational roles. And so we find it incredible as we continue to build out this experience and expanding what it means to be a leader, a joint-minded warfighter, and that principled public servant. The Vossler Academy is instilling that into the Guardians that are in our service. So it's a big reason why, right? We want to recognize the hard work and effort that that team is pouring back into these Guardians, that they're delivering back into your formations. So thanks, Chief List, and thank you, Vossler Academy, for what you do.
Again, it's never easy probably to take a 6-month pause, but it was absolutely necessary. But to think that all 3 fellowships now are up and running only within the last 6 to 7 months is really a testament to just how we're getting after things. Again, I think the CSO said, sometimes it feels like you're not going fast enough, but then you see examples of where you're making a real difference by taking a short pause and getting after things slightly different than you would have otherwise. So again, kudos to the entire team and what they've seen so far. So
Definitely, sir. So let's delve into, we've hit training, we've hit education. Let's talk about operations and how we're doing that with our range and aggressor teams and preparing our teammates in SPA 4 Gen.
So I think you probably heard a little bit about this from General Miller. So about a year ago, we were meeting with the CSO, and he challenged our team to kind of think differently about how we were looking at readiness and some of the things we were doing within STARCOM to partner across our commands. Flashpoint was kind of the output. What I'll offer is that when the CSO asked us to do 24 exercises in the year 24, we didn't quite get there. But what I'll say is that we are now embedded with SPOC and with our SSC teammates through our integrated program office for OTTI, significantly different than we were probably 6 or 7 months ago. The idea of Flashpoint was to really look at the JSOP and a lot of the certification tasks, a lot of the mission threads that we know that we have to be able to operate against within a contested environment, and start to train that differently than we ever have before. It started off with an idea. We didn't necessarily have a Delta that was responsible for this right up front. We kind of threw every expert we had at it from STARCOM, both from a headquarters and across Deltas. Spock did the exact same thing. And by June, we were ready to start executing our first of many mission threads. We're doing this every 3 weeks. The idea here is that as this continues to build out, that this will be part of the readiness certification for SPOC for each of their crews. But every 3 weeks, we've gone through and we've executed the first mission thread. We've executed 8 for mission thread 1. We finished that in November. We're on to mission thread number 2 now. So when you saw some of the presentations this morning, we talked about the threat. We're on to protect and defend. And so we're looking at how do these crews across different areas of the service, how do they operate differently than they ever did in the past? I always like to use an example from your own experience, and it puts it in context. I think back to then Major Sejba, new at US Stratcom in 2007, and certainly myself, along with many of you, probably had a front row seat to the first Chinese ASAT test. And certainly, for those of us in the domain, that was a wake-up call. It just took a lot longer until we could really get folks to understand how significant of a wake-up call it was. Fast forward about 4 or 5 years later, I'm now a squadron commander down at the ADF Southwest, and I'm routinely having to make decisions to maneuver a satellite around debris from that ASAT test. And what led into it was days of notice that the conjunction was coming, and then hours before on the phone with the 18th trying to decide whether or not the last ob was going to tell you to maneuver or not. And so that was experience that was down to the wire. It wasn't an easy call to make, but that was in a benign environment where you had time as a luxury. I take that experience and I think that just translates into Flashpoint and why it's so important that we start thinking through how are we going to operate across crews differently than we did in the past. I had a chance to sit through flashpoint number 7 for the first mission thread and watch the entire day from 7 until almost 5:30 at night when they finally did their debriefs, watching crews talking to one another, realizing information that one had that's going to benefit the other, serving as contracts across each other of information that they would like to have to help inform decisions that they're going to need to make on timelines significantly different than we've operated in a benign environment. Those are some of the things that we're working right now with SPOC to really start ringing out these different mission threads. Again, we're on mission thread 2. We're going to do 8 crews, and we'll get through those over the next several months, and we'll be on to the next mission thread. The significance, though, there doesn't just stop with the actual crew exercise that we're doing. We've also got our OTTI PEO and his team embedded in there, so that as we go through what General Saltzman called analog tabletops, we're taking the lessons and how these crews need to work together so that as we build out the digital environment that we can replicate and get the reps and sets with all of these crews coming together in that digital environment virtually, either on-prem or eventually, hopefully, from their home station. So we're trying to close those gaps so that we actually get to a realistic training environment differently than we have right now. That will serve as readiness purposes for both the crews, but also across crews as we go forward. And you can see just a few of the examples, especially on the enlisted side, getting to work with other units and understanding their mission set and information that they have that'll benefit their efforts, getting involved in large-scale mission planning that they may not have seen in the past. Those are just some of the benefits that we're already seeing by executing these on a routine basis and bringing in Guardians from across the force every 3 weeks to really work through these different tabletops.
Sarah, you talked about first, and one of the first we have, if we hit the next slide, is our cyber exercise that our aggressors kicked off called Moonlight Defender. And it was the service's first service-level cyber exercise involving an on-orbit satellite. We used Moonlighter. It's a small sat, and it's the world's first and only hacking sandbox satellite, the first in space. And our STARCOM aggressors, because once an aggressor, there we go, we're able to replicate the cyber threats that our CYS squadrons will be facing. And so we ensured, as General Sejba talked those kill chains, that we are preparing our Guardians in Flashpoint, that our Guardians know how to execute that on their mission defense systems and in their squadrons. Our aggressors provided over 60 hours of advanced training in Moonlight Defender. They performed 104 unique TTPs and conducted 154 actions on the network, which produced over 65 indicators of compromise, and they executed over 20 space cyber-enabled attacks. So what this meant is as you see in the first line there, come on, can you please let us win? What I would love to say is I would rather our teammates lose 100 times over to the aggressors than once to the threats that Chief Lurch talked about this morning. And so this is where we are empowering our Guardians so they are combat credible and have the combat capabilities to get after and protecting the space domain. It was an incredible lesson, and we are taking those TTPs and those lessons learned and rolling them back into what we are delivering and how we continue to train our Guardians in this specific, cyber operations environment.
And I think this is another great example of partnerships across commands, right? So Moonlighter started as an SSC effort here several years ago, partnered with Aerospace to build a CubeSat, launched the International Space Station, released, and actually was part of the hackathon or hackasat out of DEF CON, where they went through and they had a team of folks from around the world that really worked to hack into this system on orbit, while other folks were trying to defend it. Now the satellite itself is gone, but we still got the flat-sat, so that's going to give us quite a bit of training as we go forward. Again, showing how we need, from a cyber perspective, to protect the domain differently than we have in the past. So another great example.
Definitely, sir. So if we hit the next slide, You've heard about this, sir, so you want to highlight what we've been doing?
So many folks are already familiar with OTC, Officer Training Course. If you go back to probably this last April, maybe even a little bit before, there had been a huge effort across the service and across the commands to really start to redefine what are the roles, responsibilities of an officer enlisted and civilian in the Space Force. When you think about it fundamentally, again, if you're 15,000 strong with a third of those being officer, a third being enlisted, and a third being civilian, you really don't have any room for overlap. You really can't afford to do that. And so reimagining and then once and for all defining what those roles, responsibilities, provide that foundation that General Saltzman talked about this morning. And so once you define those roles, responsibilities, you also have to say, what is their role and how do you need to train them differently for that role? So the first piece of that then is Officer Training Course. For many of us within this room, we probably were trained in a discipline somewhere over the course of our career. You may have gotten some experiences in other disciplines, but were you ever foundationally developed in all three of the core things that make space operations work, both space operations, cyber operations, and then understanding the intelligence associated with the threats in those two different areas? That really is what OTC is now. Instead of a new officer coming in and either going off to space ops or going to Keesler or Goodfellow for intel and cyber, or going straight into acquisitions, every new officer session now, regardless of where they come from, is showing up at Peterson Space Force Base for a year of training in all three of those disciplines. From the time we were asked to go and got the final decision in the March-April timeframe, we had the first cohort up and running by early September in Colorado Springs. And I'm happy to say right now we're on the last week of the very first cohort's 4 months of space operations. As soon as they come back from the holidays, they'll start their next block, which is intelligence, and they'll do 4 months then. And then right after that, they'll go into cyber operations. At any given time, we could have up to 6 different cohorts running by the end of the year. Every 2 months, we are onboarding another cohort of roughly 80 Guardians that will go through the entire course together. And not only will they create a bond over the course of that year, that as they leave and they go off to their first operational assignment, which every Guardian will get, when they're done with that, regardless of where they go, whether it be follow on to force modernization, maybe they go and get more work into space ops, maybe they come to the institutional command. They are gonna have connections across the entire service, different than probably many of us had over the course of our career. So that was one of the fundamental things that the CSO asked us to do, was to create this course. He knew it wouldn't be perfect. So we lifted and shifted a lot of content. You know, when we looked to the intel and the cyber piece that the Air Force has provided for us, we looked at all that, we looked at their learning objectives, and we said, okay, some of this is probably not relevant for our Guardians in the space domain, but the rest of it is, and here's some more that we want to add in. And the team is off and working what that content looks like over the course of a 12-month period. It's not perfect, but it's going to continue to evolve. I can guarantee you that the course that someone goes through probably a year from now will probably be fundamentally different than what we started with. But that's how we're going to continue to evolve it. The other piece that I think is going to be really important is understanding what are Guardians coming into the service with already from a core knowledge standpoint. You know, an Astro grad from the academy probably comes in with a little bit different knowledge than someone that's coming in from OTS that might have been working on the civilian side for a while. So how do we start to baseline some of the education and the training on the accession side so that we come in with an understanding of what their baseline is, and then we pick up from there as we go through OTC. So again, huge shout out. You can see just some of the comments here. I think that fundamentally, at least the first cohort and the second cohort that are in flow right now realize this is a lot tougher than they thought it was going to be. Again, when you take some of those courses that existed, you added in a lot of the Spacepower discipline courses, which were a lot more of the advanced training that we always tried to provide Guardians, but not necessarily always were able to give them. All of that's baked in now as part of OTC.
And I think what's important is maybe to hear a little bit, and going back in our testimonials, So if we click next, you'll be able to hear a little bit from our LTs.
Is preparing us as officers for the Great Power Competition is really getting that kind of broad exposure to a lot of different things.
The coolest part about what we're doing is just being able to get inside and more in depth in what the Space Force does.
We started with some fundamentals on how does the Space Force in general work, and now we're going through the different kind of space ops categories. So really getting a piece of all of those things as we go on to move into our actual careers will let us be prepared, and we'll have a little bit more awareness of what the different pieces of the Space Force do. So we'll be better prepared for that kind of competition in the future. We'll be able to work with everyone as a more cohesive team.
It's pretty cool just to see all the moving components of the Space Force.
And I think those are just a couple of examples, obviously early on, and the testimonials, I think, here at the end of their year when they really start bringing in, the intel piece, the cyber operations piece, areas that probably a lot of them haven't seen before. I can tell you that there are folks that are coming in saying, well, wait a minute, I've done space ops for 6 or 7 years already. Why do I need to go? Well, have you done intel and cyber ops? And the answer is probably no. And so that's why it's really important that we create every Guardian now with that new foundation like the CSO mentioned this morning. I tell folks, and we've had quite a few chances here recently to talk to ROTC cadets or even cadets at the academy. And what I tell them is that it took 21 years for me personally to get experience in all 3 of those disciplines. The last one being cyber operations as a colonel. And so experience is probably not how we want to form the foundation for our Guardians. So this provides the foundation differently than any one of us has ever received in the past. But on the heels of this, equally important is how do we then start to change some of the training for our enlisted? How do we start driving more technical depth into our enlisted force across those disciplines? We've got teams of folks already that have gone through and reviewed all of the objectives of what we think we need from our enlisted force to drive technical depth and warfighting into that force. And we're ready to implement that with our partners on the Air Force side.
We're committed to our Guardians' mastery of the space domain and what they're delivering into those operational floors and into the service. So when we talk about ops, if we hit to our next slide here, we've talked a little bit about training, education, but we also in STARCOM have a responsibility to test and evaluation. And we get after that by sending and selecting Guardians to attend Space Test Course. And the Space Test Course, right, is kind of our version of where we're integrated with the test pilot school community and ensuring our Guardians, much as an airman would get into an aircraft and work with an instructor and get checked out and be a master on that particular aircraft and what they're doing through the test pilot school, we're doing that through the Space Test Course. And it's the starting point for Space Force training and test and evaluation. And we just last week graduated a 12-month cohort of Guardians out of Space Test Course. And it was incredible to see that accomplishment of the education, the training, and we'll call it how they were committed to their mastery in this environment, utilizing a satellite that they affectionately called Javi. Its name is XVII, and it was a platform that was delivered to us by our AFRL teammates. And it provided a sandbox-like environment for our test space cohort Guardians to get after what they were asked to do in ensuring that we could deliver credible and capable operational systems back into our service and to the force. You're seeing in this photo here is the first cohort of Guardians that actually command and controlled Javi, mastered it, and are now integrated back into your formations and in our formations in the test community. So it's important for us to continually vector check and understand where we can partner together to leverage these capabilities in the test and eval environment.
So if you think about kind of STARCOM's missions, Guardian development, which we talked a lot about, combat credibility really starts to fall into the Space Test Course. This is how we're trying to produce Guardians differently so that in a contested environment, in a warfighting environment, we start partnering early with our acquisition teammates and really getting in from an integrated test standpoint. Again, many of the systems that we are starting to deliver in field require combat credibility differently than many of the systems that we fielded in the past and operated for decades. And so by having this level of expertise on par with what their counterparts in the Air Force have done for many years, this is how we're starting to develop a different type of Guardian who can think about space tests differently and really understand weapon system effectiveness and what it's going to take to be able to operate in a contested environment significantly different than we have in the past. So a year-long course, again, it's an investment. There's investments across the board that we're making in Guardians. But these are the types of investments that are going to pay off very quickly and for many years to come as we continue to really drive in this warfighting domain differently.
So I think our next kind of experience that we're going to talk about is how we continue to build those cadets that are entering and assessing into our service.
So this is really starting to get left of the session. This is really starting to get after ROTC, some of our academy cadets, and others that in the past we didn't necessarily have a dedicated course really to introduce them to what space is. Azimuth was started here 2 years ago. This last summer we had 3 different cohorts that went through 3-week courses, roughly about 80 cadets across the board, both from the academy, from some of the other military academies, quite a few ROTC cadets that already knew that they were coming in to be Guardians. And then at least for the very first cohort this summer, we had 2 civilians that were there as well from our SSC teammates. Again, the idea here is how to introduce them to some of the fundamentals of space and then give them some experience. So, in Colorado Springs at the academy for 3 weeks, but they get to visit Cheyenne Mountain. They go out to visit STARCOM. They visit SPOC and some of the units there. They go up to Denver and they visit some of our industry players and get to see both commercial and maybe some of our traditional industry players and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They're part of a joint exercise that's hosted there. And you can see just some of the things that they actually got to be a part of. Electromagnetic support teams, actually getting interwoven into kind of a warfighting exercise over the course of those 3 weeks. Those just gave them experiences, again, differently than they would have received through any other ROTC or probably even academy type training. So again, highly successful. And what I really liked about this year was the fact that we started to bring in a larger percentage of Guardians, both from the academy and ROTC, but bringing in some of our civilians with overwhelming positive feedback on what they learned and what they took away from that 3-week experience.
So I think one of my favorite testimonials, we had a West Point cadet come in, and she shared on how she better understood as a future Army officer how space is going to be interwoven into what she's going to be tasked to do in the Army. And so, not only are we delivering more combat credible Guardians into our formation, but we are now delivering more combat credible joint officers as they're coming in, having those touch points with what we're delivering in STARCOM into our Guardians. Awesome.
So let's move on from Azimuth. I think we got at least one more example here.
Definitely. So we want to highlight this gem that STARCOM, in partnership with many teams across the Space Force, just executed. And we had, on our slide here, we executed the beta course, the first course of our civilian acclimation course. We had about 30 civilian teammates from across SSC be the inaugural classmates and understanding, because we owe it to a third of our force, which makes up the Space Force of civilians, to understand the team they're joining and what they're going to be responsible for and who they're going to be working with. And this was something we recognized that was not only lacking in the Space Force, but was kind of an opportunity for us to get after in the Department of the Air Force, to strengthen those teams on how we get together for our teammates that may not be in uniform. The goal here was to introduce civilians to the team that they joined, to have them understand the space domain, to have them understand the threats that they will be challenged with and facing, to better understand the teammates that are in uniform that they are working with to their left and their right. And then to present it in a fashion, in a model that was interactive, that was intimate, that was to allow our teammates, these civilians, to understand what it really meant to be a part of this family, the team that they committed to, so they can understand what they bring to our force and how we value them inherently because like the CSO has stated and what General Sejba has said, we are 15,000 strong, and we cannot do what we do without our civilian guardians in our formations.
And again, a pilot effort, we're going to take lessons from this first 2 weeks. We're going to roll those into another pilot sometime early next year. Really proud, and just a shout out to the partnerships that made this happen. Certainly a huge effort across my STARCOM team of folks really just reimagining what they would want to understand when it came to officer enlisted civilian roles, responsibilities, how to actually provide that over a couple weeks, but then really partnering with SSC. So I really appreciate the partnership. This was held out in Los Angeles. They brought a lot of guardians, both from LA, but also from across the country to be a part of it, handpicked, so that we got a range of experiences and we got some really just fundamental and phenomenal feedback from this team. Again, work to go here. But this will then help set a baseline for our civilian workforce so they understand the critical role they play within the service in line with the officer enlisted civilian roles responsibilities. I think some of the feedback, especially from some of the early, the brand new civilian guardians, it really put a finer point and an understanding, not only what their role was, but really hearing from some of our space warfighters from across the service and how critical their role was. It put a little bit more emphasis and understanding of, what seems like some days maybe working in a cube, understanding just how critical your role in delivering capability is. Those were just some of the things that they walked away from. But again, really happy with how the first acclimation class went. Look forward to seeing how we replicate this and then provide this routinely across the service for our new civilian guardians. So.
Sir, I think they've heard enough from us. Let's have them hear from one of our teammates that actually was part of this beta course.
I think it's a must attend for anybody who's a new civilian into the Space Force community.
If you want to understand your work and the bigger mission and the bigger calling that comes with being part of the Space Force, this course really puts it all back together for you.
This is the kind of course that provides you with your why.
Why you're here as a guardian, why your piece in the mission makes a big impact overall.
It gave me an opportunity to adjust how I think, not only about space, but just how I think about problem solving, which gave me an opportunity to really reflect on my leadership style and how I want to communicate with other people.
Is because Space Force is so new, a lot of the culture is still being established. And so as a new civilian into the force, I feel like I have the power to shape what culture is going to be moving forward.
There's really no other course that I've attended in my military career or in my civilian career that I felt was more tangibly beneficial to me and something that I could actually take with me and apply.
Awesome. That's just a little bit of the feedback from our first pilot, so more to come on that. So.
Definitely, and I think we're running out of time, but before we get off stage, if we can get to that last slide. And sir, we've done a lot over this last year in preparing our guardians and delivering them back into the service. And these are just a small highlights of what the STARCOM team in partnership with our guardians across the Space Force have been delivering and instilling, right, that culture, enhancing the guardian spirit and the guardian experiences across the Space Force.
So again, my thanks to the entire team. If you see a blue patch, reach out, say thanks to them. They're doing some tremendous work on a day-to-day basis. My thanks to my fellow field commanders and certainly to the headquarters for the partnerships that we continue to form across the service. Again, the mountain, we're not really sure where the end is. We know there's still a lot of work to go. But I'm very confident that we've got a great team that's doing a lot of good things right now and putting a foundation in that's going to last for a long time for our service, for our guardians. So thank you very much for being a part of today.
Semper Super team.
Thanks.
Happy birthday, Space Force.